Snowflakes like shattered glass slashed sideways across the frozen Colorado landscape, burying everything under feet of suffocating white. Buried beneath a seemingly undisturbed drift, a 15-year-old girl lay perfectly still, listening to the howling wind. Above ground, she was a missing person statistic, a forgotten runaway doomed to freeze. Below ground, bathed in the soft orange glow of a subterranean hearth, Chloe Harper rested her blistered hands on a floor radiating impossible warmth. Betrayed by her own blood and banished into the brutal wild, she hadn't just survived the decade's deadliest blizzard. She had engineered an underground fortress out of dirt, scavenged trash, and sheer defiance. This is the story of how she did it. Oak Haven, Colorado, was a town that forgave nothing, least of all weakness. Nestled in the jagged foothills of the San Juan Mountains, it was a place where winter arrived in November and refused to leave until May. For 15-year-old Chloe Harper, the cold inside her home had long surpassed the chill of the mountain air. It was October 14th, a Tuesday, when the fragile thread holding her life together finally snapped. The inciting incident was tragically trivial, a hallmark of domestic tyrants. Her stepfather, Richard Bowman, a man whose temper was as volatile as a primed grenade, could not find his prized hunting binoculars. He had left them on the dashboard of his rusted Ford F-150, but in his mind, the only logical explanation was that Chloe had stolen them to pawn. Chloe stood in the cramped, linoleum-floored kitchen, her backpack slung over one shoulder, having just returned from the local high school. Richard loomed over her, his face flushed a mottled crimson, his breath reeking of cheap domestic beer and chewing tobacco. "You're a parasite, just like your real father," Richard spat, his voice dropping to that dangerous, gravelly register that usually preceded violence. "Living under my roof, eating my food, and stealing my gear." "I didn't take them, Richard," Chloe said. Her voice was steady, though her knees trembled. She had learned years ago that crying only fueled his rage. "I haven't even been in the garage." She looked past his broad shoulders, locking eyes with her mother, Sarah. Sarah stood by the sink, furiously scrubbing a cast-iron pan that was already clean. Her knuckles were white. Chloe waited for the intervention, for the maternal defense that instinct dictated should come. But Sarah only lowered her head further, letting her blonde hair fall like a curtain to shield her face. That silence was the most deafening sound Chloe had ever heard. It was the sound of total abandonment. "Pack whatever fits in that bag," Richard ordered, pointing a thick, calloused finger toward the front door. "You're done here. Get out." "Richard, she's 15, Sarah whispered weakly, not looking up. "It's getting cold." "She's a thief, Sarah, and she's old enough to figure it out. There's a homeless shelter in Durango. She can walk." He turned back to Chloe, his eyes dead and unblinking. 5 minutes, or I start throwing your things in the burn barrel." Chloe didn't argue. She knew the mechanics of this house too well. Survival here meant knowing when a battle was already lost. She turned and walked down the narrow, dimly lit hallway to her bedroom. It was a stark space, devoid of the posters and clutter typical of a teenage girl. She moved methodically. Into her heavy canvas backpack went 3 pairs of thick wool socks, 2 pairs of fleece-lined jeans, thermal underwear, a heavy flannel shirt, and her oversized winter parka. From her nightstand, she grabbed a small, battered metal tin. Inside was her most prized possession, a Swiss Army knife her biological father had given her before he disappeared from her life, a spool of thick fishing line, a magnesium fire starter, and $43 in crumpled bills. As she walked back through the living room, neither Richard nor her mother said a word. The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind her, sealing her fate. The air outside was already biting, the temperature hovering in the low 40s as the sun began its descent behind the craggy peaks. Chloe stood at the end of the gravel driveway, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face. Durango was 30 miles away. She had no phone, no car, and no safety net. To walk the highway at night was to invite a different kind of danger. She looked toward the sprawling, dense expanse of the Blackwood timber tract that bordered the rear of Richard's property. It was hundreds of acres of forgotten, rugged wilderness, owned by a defunct logging company. Panic, sharp and metallic, tasted like blood in the back of her throat. She was a child, thrust into a world indifferent to her existence. But as she stared into the darkening woods, the panic slowly crystallized into something else: anger. A cold, hard, crystalline fury. They expected her to fail. They expected her to crawl back, begging, or to disappear into the cracks of the foster system. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, turning her back on the gravel road that led to civilization. Instead, she stepped over the rusted barbed wire fence and disappeared into the shadows of the pines. She wouldn't freeze, and she wouldn't beg. She would build. The first night was a brutal teacher. Chloe hiked 2 miles deep into the Blackwood tract, navigating by the fading twilight and the silhouettes of towering Douglas firs. She needed a location invisible from any trail, far enough from Richard's property that neither he nor his hunting dogs would ever stumble upon it. She found it on the leeward side of a steep, rocky ravine. A massive, ancient oak tree had uprooted years ago, its colossal root system tearing a natural depression into the side of the hill. The fallen trunk provided a natural camouflage and a windbreak. It was a raw, gaping wound in the earth, smelling of damp loam and decaying leaves. That night, Chloe slept curled into a tight ball at the bottom of the depression, buried under a pile of dry pine needles and her heavy parka. The temperature plummeted below freezing. She woke up every hour, her body racked with violent shivers, her joints aching as if beaten with hammers. By dawn, the frost had painted the woods in a glittering, deadly white. She knew with absolute certainty that she would not survive a week above ground. The winter storms were coming, bringing sub-zero temperatures that would kill her in her sleep. To survive, she had to go under. The next 3 days were a masterclass in agonizing labor. She possessed no shovel, only her hands, a sturdy stick, and her small pocket knife. The soil beneath the top layer of forest duff was packed hard with clay and interwoven with thick, stubborn roots. Chloe began excavating the depression, expanding it into the hillside. She used a sharpened wedge of hardwood to chip away at the earth, scooping the loose dirt out with her bare hand. Within hours, her fingernails were packed with black dirt, and raw, weeping blisters had formed on her palms. When the blisters tore open, she wrapped her hands in strips torn from a spare t-shirt and kept digging. The pain was a constant, blinding companion, but it was also a distraction from the gnawing hunger in her stomach. She rationed the few granola bars she had in her bag, drinking from a clear, freezing stream at the bottom of the ravine. By the end of the 3rd day, she realized she needed a real tool. Working entirely by hand would take weeks she didn't have. Risking exposure, she crept back toward the outskirts of civilization, under the cover of darkness. She bypassed Richard's property, hiking instead toward an abandoned mining shed on the edge of town. There, amidst rusted gears and rotting timber, she found salvation: a heavy, flat-nosed iron spade with a splintered wooden handle. It was heavy and awkward for a 15-year-old girl, but it was a weapon against the earth. Returning to her sight, the work accelerated. The design in her head was simple but ambitious. She wasn't digging a grave, she was carving out a room. She dug a rectangular space straight into the slope of the hill, roughly 6 feet wide, 8 feet long, and 4 feet deep. Because it was built into a slope, the back wall was entirely earth, while the front would be partially open, needing a constructed wall and an entryway. Every swing of the spade sent shockwaves up her arms. The roots of the surrounding trees fought her at every inch. She used her pocket knife's small saw blade to painstakingly sever roots as thick as her wrists, spending hours on a single obstacle. Her muscles, unaccustomed to such extreme manual labor, burned with lactic acid. She lost track of time. Days blurred into a singular cycle of digging, hauling dirt, and collapsing into a fitful, shivering sleep. She stockpiled the excavated dirt around the perimeter of her pit, forming thick, compacted berms that would later serve as the foundation for her roof. The earth was a perfect insulator, holding a stable temperature of around 50 degrees year-round, regardless of the blizzard raging above. On the 8th day, a light dusting of snow fell. Chloe stood in the center of her excavated hole. The walls were remarkably sheer and stable, thanks to the dense clay content. She was standing chest-deep in the earth. It was raw, muddy, and smelled of worms and ancient dirt. But as the wind howled through the treetops above, barely a breeze touched her at the bottom of the pit. The earth had embraced her. Now, she had to build the systems that would keep her alive. A hole in the ground is just a freezing mud pit without shelter and warmth. Chloe knew she needed a roof to keep the snow out and a heat source to survive the plummeting night temperatures. But a fire inside an enclosed underground space would kill her with carbon monoxide long before the cold did. Chloe had always been a quiet, observant student. She spent her lunch hours in the school library, escaping the noise of her peers. She recalled reading an encyclopedia entry about traditional Korean architecture, specifically the ondol, a system of underfloor heating where smoke and heat from a fire are drawn through a network of flues beneath a masonry floor before exiting through a chimney. It was brilliant, efficient, and dangerous to replicate. Before the ground froze solid, she began constructing her masterpiece. First, she needed to scavenge again. She made a daring midnight raid to the Excavating municipal dump. Moving like a ghost through the rusted cars and piles of discarded appliances, she found exactly what she needed. A large, heavy-duty waterproof tarp, a length of 6-inch galvanized steel stovepipe, and a discarded cast-iron wood stove door. Dragging the materials back through the dense woods took the entire night. By sunrise, she was exhausted, but her mind was racing with engineering plans. She started by digging a long, narrow trench down the center of her earthen floor, about 2 feet deep and a foot wide. At the front of the dugout, near where her doorway would be, she excavated a deeper, wider firebox. This was the heart of the system. She lined the firebox with heavy, flat river stones. She hauled one by one from the stream, using thick, wet clay as mortar to cement them into place. The trench, extending from the firebox, ran the entire length of the floor. She lined this trench with stones as well, creating a hollow tunnel. At the far end of the dugout, she dug a vertical shaft straight up through the earthen ceiling and fitted the scavenged steel pipe into it, sealing the gaps with more wet clay. The most critical part was the floor itself. If the smoke leaked into the room, she would suffocate. She spent days scouring the ravine for large, flat slabs of slate and shale. It was backbreaking work. She pried the heavy stones from the earth, rolling and sliding them back to her camp. She laid these flat stones over the top of the trench, creating a solid floor over the hollow flue. To ensure it was airtight, Chloe mixed clay from the hillside with water from the stream and dried pine needles, stomping it with her boots to create a thick, sticky cob mortar. She spread this mud mixture heavily over the stone floor, filling every crack and sealing the stones perfectly. She smoothed it out with her hands, creating a flat, continuous floor that hid the heating trench beneath. Next came the roof. She utilized the natural structure of the fallen oak tree, laying thick, sturdy spruce branches across the top of her pit, resting them on the earthen berm she had built. Over these branches, she stretched the heavy waterproof tarp, tying it down securely with her fishing line and scavenged wire. Over the tarp, she piled a foot of pine needles, leaves, and finally, a thick layer of the excavated dirt. This created a highly insulated living roof that seamlessly blended into the forest floor. Unless someone stepped directly on it, it was entirely invisible. For the entrance, she built a small, low tunnel facing downhill, framing it with scavenged timber and hanging an old wool blanket she had found at the dump as a door, backed by a woven barrier of pine boughs to block the wind. On the evening of November 3rd, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Chloe sat shivering in her dark, damp dugout. The mud floor was still slightly wet. It was time for the ultimate test. She gathered dry birch bark, kindling, and small logs she had meticulously split using her spade and a heavy rock. Kneeling at the firebox near the entrance, she arranged the kindling and struck her magnesium fire starter. Sparks showered down. The birch bark caught, a tiny, bright flame flickering in the gloom. She gently fed it, nursing the fire until the thicker wood caught. Then, she held her breath. If the draft wasn't strong enough, the smoke would pour back into the room. For a terrifying minute, gray smoke billowed out of the firebox, stinging her eyes and making her cough. She scrambled backward, ready to flee. But then, physics took over. The hot air pushed into the cold trench, finding the path of least resistance toward the vertical chimney pipe at the back. With a low, rushing whoosh, the smoke reversed direction. The fire roared to life, the flames pulling horizontally into the underfloor tunnel. Chloe scrambled out of her entrance tunnel and looked at the hillside behind her dugout. A thin, steady column of white smoke was rising from the hidden steel pipe, dissipating quickly into the freezing night air. She crawled back inside. The air in the dugout was completely clear of smoke. She sat on the cold mud floor and waited. 20 minutes later, she placed her hand on the clay floor near the back of the room. It was warm. 10 minutes after that, the entire stone and mud floor began to radiate a deep, penetrating heat. The clay baked hard, sealing the system permanently. The thermal mass of the rocks and earth absorbed the heat from the fire, turning the entire floor of her underground bunker into a massive radiator. Chloe took off her heavy winter parka. She lay flat on her back on the heated floor, feeling the warmth seep through her clothes, melting away the deep, aching cold that had settled in her bones over the past 3 weeks. She stared up at the ceiling of reinforced timber and earth, illuminated by the warm orange glow spilling from the firebox. She was completely alone. She was 15. But as she closed her eyes, enveloped in the cocoon of warmth she had torn from the earth with her own bleeding hands, Chloe Harper smiled for the first time in a very long time. Let the winter come. She was ready. December arrived not with a gentle dusting, but with a meteorological violence that local news anchors would later call the storm of the century. A bomb cyclone formed over the Rockies, stalling above the San Juan Mountains and burying Oakhaven under 40 inches of snow in less than 48 hours. The temperature plummeted to 22 degrees below zero, not factoring in a wind chill that could flash freeze exposed skin in minutes. Above ground, power lines snapped like brittle twigs under the weight of the ice. Highways were shut down. In her cramped, subterranean sanctuary, Chloe Harper listened to the apocalyptic roar of the wind tearing through the tops of the Blackwood timber tract. The sound was terrifying, a continuous, deafening shriek that vibrated down through the roots of the fallen oak tree and into the walls of her dugout. Yet, inside, it was a staggering 65 degrees. The Ondal system was a triumph of desperation. The thick, clay-sealed floor radiated a deep, constant heat. Chloe sat cross-legged on her scavenged wool blanket, her heavy parka discarded in the corner. She fed small, precisely split logs into the firebox, watching the flames stretch horizontally into the underfloor flue. The earth above her head was frozen solid, creating an impenetrable dome of permafrost that only reinforced her structural integrity. But survival is a merciless accountant, and Chloe's ledger was unbalanced. While the dugout was warm, the extreme cold demanded a relentless supply of fuel to maintain the thermal mass of the floor. By the morning of the 3rd day of the blizzard, her stockpile of dried birch and pine, meticulously gathered and stacked inside the entrance tunnel, was terrifyingly low. She had enough wood for perhaps 8 more hours. If the fire died, the clay floor would cool, the residual dampness of the earth would seep back in, and the dugout would become a subterranean freezer. She had to go out. Chloe layered her clothing: thermal underwear, 2 pairs of jeans, a flannel shirt, a fleece, and her heavy parka. She wrapped the torn remnants of a cotton t-shirt around her face, leaving only a narrow slit for her eyes. She gripped her iron spade, pushed aside the wool blanket door, and crawled into the entrance tunnel. The moment she breached the barrier of woven pine boughs, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The wind knocked her backward. The world outside was a swirling, opaque vortex of blinding white. The towering pines she used as landmarks were completely erased by the whiteout. The snow was chest-high, a powdery, suffocating ocean. Panic, sharp and immediate, pierced her chest. "Do not lose the door," she told herself. "If you lose the door, you die." She tied one end of her fishing line to the exposed root of the fallen oak tree that framed her entrance, wrapping the spool tightly around her left wrist. She needed deadwood branches snapped off by the wind. She waded forward, the snow fighting her every movement, her iron spade used more as a probing cane than a digging tool. 10 yards out, 15 yards out. The cold was already biting through her heavy gloves, her fingers turning stiff and clumsy. She found a fallen spruce limb, dragged it toward her, and used the edge of the spade to hack it into manageable pieces. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. As she pivoted to drag the wood back, her boot caught on something hard and unnatural hidden beneath the snow. She stumbled, falling face first into the freezing powder. Gasping, she pushed herself up and brushed the snow away from the object. It wasn't a log. It was synthetic fabric, a heavy, camouflaged canvas duffel bag, half buried near the base of a jagged boulder. Chloe froze. Who would be out here? She remembered Richard's hunting buddies, men who treated the Blackwood tract like their personal playground. She frantically dug around the bag with her stiffened hands. Attached to the heavy zipper was a laminated hunting tag. She brushed the frost off it, Arthur Pendleton. Elk Tag. Zone 4. Arthur Pendleton was an out-of-state hunter she had once seen at the local gas station, a man who possessed more expensive gear than actual woodsman skills. He must have dropped the bag months ago during the early autumn bow hunting season, losing it in the thick underbrush before the snows came. With her heart pounding, Chloe yanked the frozen zipper. It refused to budge. She pulled off her right glove, taking her Swiss Army knife from her pocket, and used the flathead screwdriver attachment to pry the ice out of the zipper's teeth. The ambient air immediately began sapping the heat from her exposed hand. Within seconds, her skin flushed bright red, then transitioned to a dangerous, waxy white. Ignoring the burning pain, she forced the zipper open. Inside was a treasure trove that made her gasp out loud. Vacuum-sealed packages of high-calorie venison jerky, 4 foil-wrapped blocks of military-grade emergency rations, a heavy, insulated thermos, a fully stocked first aid kit, and, most miraculously, a small, collapsible folding saw with a serrated steel blade. The wind howled louder, a stark reminder of her peril. Her exposed hand was now entirely numb, a block of useless meat. She clumsily shoved her gloved hand back on, biting back a sob of pain. She grabbed the handles of the heavy canvas bag with her good hand, clamped the gathered firewood under her arm, and pulled the taut fishing line attached to her wrist. Hand over hand, blinded by the snow, she followed the thin, invisible thread back to the hollow beneath the oak tree. When she finally collapsed through the entrance tunnel and pulled the wool blanket shut, she was trembling violently. She dragged the canvas bag into the warm, orange glow of the dugout and curled up next to the firebox, shoving her freezing hands under her armpits to slowly thaw them. As the agonizing, prickling sensation of returning blood flooded her fingers, she stared at the hunter's bag. She had food for a month. She had a saw to cut wood efficiently. The blizzard raged above, screaming its fury. But Chloe Harper just laughed a breathless, ragged sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. By late January, the acute desperation of survival had settled into a grueling, rhythmic monotony. Chloe had become a creature of the earth. Her hands were permanently calloused, her face smeared with soot, and her senses honed to a razor's edge. The dugout smelled faintly of wood smoke, damp clay, and the dried pine needles she used for bedding. The supplies from Arthur Pendleton's dropped bag had saved her life, but the high-calorie rations were strictly guarded. To supplement her diet, Chloe had become a trapper. Using the wire from the scavenged dump materials and the internal strands of her heavy fishing line, she had set up a dozen small snares in the thickets surrounding the ravine, targeting the snowshoe hares that left distinct tracks in the fresh powder. It was a Tuesday evening when the isolation of the Blackwood tract was violently shattered. Chloe had been successful that morning, pulling a plump hare from a snare near the frozen stream. The temperature outside was hovering around 0, but inside her bunker, the ondol floor was radiating its steady, comforting heat. She had carefully skinned and cleaned the animal using her pocket knife, skewering the meat on a sharpened green stick over the open firebox. The rich, heavy scent of roasting meat filled the small space, a rare and intoxicating luxury. She was just pulling the meat away from the flames when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. The wind was a chaotic, sweeping noise. This sound was deliberate, heavy. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps in the snow, directly above her head. Chloe froze, the stick trembling in her hands. The earth ceiling was roughly 18 inches thick, a layer of logs, a tarp, and packed, frozen dirt. It was strong enough to hold heavy snow, but it wasn't a concrete bunker. The footsteps stopped directly over the center of her roof. Then came a sound that made the blood drain from her face, a deep, resonant sniffing. It was a wet, heavy inhalation, followed by a low, vibrating growl that rattled the dust from the ceiling timbers. It wasn't a man. It was a mountain lion. The harsh winter had driven the deer and elk down into the valleys, leaving apex predators starving and desperate in the higher elevations. The thick smell of roasting hare, venting out through the steel chimney pipe and seeping through the frozen earth, was a dinner bell to a starving 200-pound cat. Scrape, thud, scrape. The mountain lion began to dig. Massive, clawed paws tore at the frozen dirt and pine needles directly above her. Chloe dropped the meat and backed against the earthen wall, her eyes wide with terror. She could see the heavy spruce logs of her ceiling bowing slightly under the immense weight of the animal. If it breached the tarp and the logs gave way, it would drop directly into her confined space. A 15-year-old girl with a pocket knife would not survive 3 seconds in a pit with a starving cougar. Scrape. Re-eep. A horrifying sound echoed through the dugout, the distinct tearing of the thick, waterproof tarp she had scavenged from the dump. The lion had breached the frozen soil and hit the second layer of her defense. Dirt began to shower down through the gaps in the spruce logs, landing on her clay floor. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but the cold logic of survival she had cultivated over the past 3 months overrode the fear. She couldn't fight it hand to claw. She had to use her environment. She had to use the one thing animals feared more than starvation: fire. Chloe lunged toward the firebox. She grabbed a thick, half-burned branch of pine, the end glowing with bright, red-hot coals. Next, she grabbed her heavy iron spade. She didn't run toward the entrance. She stood directly beneath the shower of falling dirt, right under where the beast was furiously digging. She raised the heavy iron spade and smashed it upward against the thickest spruce log in her ceiling with all her might. Clang! The concussive force of iron hitting wood reverberated through the small space like a gunshot. The digging above stopped instantly. Before the animal could recover its nerve, Chloe took the burning pine branch and shoved it directly into the firebox, burying it into the bed of hot coals to agitate the flames, tossing a handful of damp pine needles directly onto the fire. Thick, acrid, gray smoke billowed up. Because she had momentarily blocked the underfloor draft with the sudden influx of fuel and wet needles, the smoke didn't get sucked into the trench. Instead, it plumed upward, filling the dugout and seeping straight up through the gaps in the logs, right into the face of the animal above. A sharp, hacking cough echoed from the roof, followed by an angry, startled hiss. Chloe hit the ceiling again with the spade. Clang! 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 She screamed at the top of her lungs, a feral, unhinged sound that shocked even her. Get away! Get away! The combination of the blinding, choking smoke rising through the earth, the deafening metallic ringing, and the unnatural human screams was too much for the predator's frayed nerves. Chloe heard a frantic scrambling sound, the heavy thump of paws hitting the snow beside the dugout, and then the rapid crunch, crunch, crunch of the mountain lion sprinting away into the timber track. Chloe dropped the spade. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the warm, hard clay floor, gasping for clean air beneath the dissipating smoke. Dirt continued to trickle down through the torn tarp, settling into her hair. She lay there for an hour, listening to the absolute silence of the winter woods, waiting for the beast to return. It never did. She had defended her fortress. She was no longer just surviving the elements. She was holding her ground against the true masters of the wild. But as she looked up at the compromised, dirt-showering ceiling, a grim realization settled over her. The winter was only half over, and her sanctuary was wounded. Dawn arrived as a muted, gray sliver slicing through the ruptured ceiling of the dugout. Dirt continued to patter down in a slow, agonizing drizzle, landing on the hardened clay floor and Chloe's sleeping bag. The mountain lion had not returned, but it had left a mortal wound on her sanctuary. The thick waterproof tarp, the primary barrier between her and the suffocating weight of the Colorado snowpack, was shredded. Structural integrity was paramount. Without the tarp, the warmth from the ondule floor would melt the snow sitting directly on the spruce log. That meltwater would seep through the cracks, turn her clay floor back into freezing mud, and eventually drown the firebox. Chloe forced herself up. Her muscles screamed in protest, a cocktail of adrenaline hangover and deep tissue exhaustion. She grabbed Arthur Pendleton's collapsible saw and her heavy iron spade. Stepping into the entrance tunnel, she pushed aside the woven pine boughs. Outside, the blizzard had temporarily exhausted itself, leaving behind a crystalline, frozen wasteland under a sky the color of bruised iron. The temperature was hovering near 10 below. Every breath felt like inhaling shattered glass. Climbing the snowdrift beside her dugout, she surveyed the damage. The cougar had excavated a massive crater in the snow and dirt, exposing the splintered spruce logs and the slashed blue plastic of the tarp. Repairing it required a desperate improvisation. Chloe didn't have another tarp. What she did have was the heavy, waterproof canvas of Arthur Pendleton's duffel bag. Working with frantic, shivering energy, she emptied the survival supplies into the dugout. Using her pocket knife, she meticulously cut the seams of the massive duffel bag, transforming it into a flat, durable sheet of heavy canvas. It wasn't as large as the tarp, but it would cover the breach. She climbed back onto the roof. Her hands, despite her heavy gloves, were going numb. She cleared the loose snow and dirt from the torn section, laying the canvas flat over the splintered logs. To secure it, she used the high-tensile parachute cord she found in the hunter's kit, lashing the canvas to the exposed roots of the fallen oak tree. Next came the insulation. She used the spade to hack chunks of frozen earth and ice, piling them heavily over the canvas to weigh it down and recreate the thermal barrier. The exertion was immense. Sweat pooled beneath her multiple layers of clothing, a lethal mistake in sub-zero temperatures. By the time she slid back down into the entrance tunnel and dragged the wool blanket shut, she was panting heavily, her chest rattling with a strange, wet friction. She stripped off her damp outer layers and huddled over the firebox, feeding it dry birch to get the floor radiating again. But the cold had already done its work, bypassing her skin and settling deep within her lungs. 48 hours later, the true cost of the roof repair manifested. It started with a tickle in the back of her throat, rapidly escalating into a violent, hacking cough that brought up rust-colored phlegm. Then came the fever. In the damp, isolated darkness of the dugout, sickness was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. By the third night of her illness, Chloe was delirious. The dugout fluctuated wildly between feeling like a blast furnace and an icebox. She lay curled on the heated floor, soaked in sweat, her teeth chattering so violently she bit her own lip, tasting copper. Shadows danced on the earthen walls, morphing into the faces of the people who had abandoned her. She saw her stepfather, Richard Bowman, standing over her, his face contorted in rage, yelling about his stolen binoculars. She saw her mother, Sarah, turning her back, shrinking into the kitchen wallpaper. "I didn't take them," Chloe rasped to the empty room, her voice a broken whisper. "I didn't." The fire was dying. She could feel the clay floor cooling beneath her cheek. The logical part of her brain, the survivalist that had built this fortress, screamed at her to move, to put wood in the firebox. But her body refused to obey. Gravity felt like a physical weight pressing her into the dirt. In her fever dream, Mr. Harrison, her old high school biology teacher, sat cross-legged next to the firebox. "Cellular respiration, Chloe," the hallucination said cheerfully. "Without thermal regulation, the enzymatic processes in your body will cease. You're going into hypothermic shock." She blinked, the hallucination dissolving into the glowing, dying embers of the fire. She dragged herself forward on her elbows. Every inch was a battle against her own failing biology. She reached the pile of split wood, her trembling fingers closing around a small log. She shoved it into the firebox, followed by a handful of dry bark. She blew softly on the embers. The exertion made her vision swim with black spots. A small flame caught, licking at the bark. Chloe collapsed beside the firebox. She remembered the first aid kit in Pendleton's bag. With agonizing slowness, she pulled the red plastic box toward her. Her blurry eyes scanned the contents. Bandages, antiseptic, medical tape. And there, in a small blister pack, ibuprofen and broad-spectrum antibiotics, amoxicillin, likely prescribed for a hunting trip gone wrong. She dry-swallowed 2 of the massive antibiotic pills and 3 ibuprofen, chasing them with a handful of melted snow from her tin cup. For 2 days, Chloe lived in a state of semi-consciousness, surfacing only to shove wood into the fire and force down bites of military rations. The battle was fought entirely internally, her immune system waging war against the infection, while the Ondol floor kept the freezing death of the Colorado winter at bay. On the morning of the 3rd day, the fever broke. Chloe opened her eyes. The dugout was silent, smelling of wood smoke and stale sweat. She was incredibly weak, her muscles atrophied and trembling, but the crushing weight in her chest had lifted. She pressed a hand to her forehead. It was cool. She had survived the betrayal of her own body. But as February crept closer, the wilderness prepared to deliver a threat she could not cure with scavenged pills. February offered no reprieve in temperature, but it brought a shift in the nature of the cruelty. The sun, previously a distant, sterile white disk, began to project genuine warmth during the brief afternoon hours. This created a treacherous cycle. The top layer of the snowpack would melt slightly at 2 p.m., only to flash freeze into a razor-sharp crust of solid ice when the sun dipped below the peaks at 4 p.m. Chloe had been underground for nearly 4 months. Her hair was matted, her clothes practically rotting off her frame, but her spirit was forged steel. The illness had stripped away the last remnants of the frightened teenager who had walked out of Oakhaven. What remained was a feral, calculating survivor. Food was running dangerously low. Pendleton's high-calorie rations were gone, leaving only a few strips of venison jerky. Her snares near the dugout had stopped producing, the local hare population having wised up or been hunted out by the cougar. She needed to expand her trapping lines further down the ravine, near the border of the Blackwood timber tract and the county access roads. It was a calculated risk. Moving further from the dugout meant greater exposure, but starving in a warm room was still starving. Armed with her iron spade, her pocket knife, and a coil of snare wire, she ventured out just after dawn. The icy crust on the snow supported her weight, allowing her to move quickly without sinking. She hiked nearly a mile, navigating the dense stands of lodgepole pines, looking for the telltale signs of game trails. She found a promising thicket of scrub oak and knelt to set a wire loop. As she brushed away a dusting of fresh powder from the ice crust, her hand stopped dead. There, frozen perfectly in the solid ice, was a footprint. Chloe's heart slammed against her ribs. She leaned closer. It wasn't a wolf or a bear. It was a large, heavy boot print. The tread pattern was distinct, deep, aggressive lugs, the kind found on expensive winter logging boots. She instinctively ducked low, making herself as small as possible behind the scrub oak. Her eyes scanned the silent, frozen forest. The print was old, perhaps a few days, trapped in the ice during the last melt-freeze cycle, but it meant someone was out here. She followed the track with her eyes. There wasn't just one. A trail of them marched parallel to the ravine, heading deeper into the Blackwood tract, and beside the heavy boot prints were the distinct, four-toed tracks of a large dog. A cold dread, far more terrifying than the winter wind, pooled in her stomach. She recognized that boot tread. She had scrubbed the mud out of those exact boots on the back porch of her house 100 times. Richard Bowman. Why was he here? The police would have stopped looking for a runaway months ago, assuming she was dead or in another state. Richard wasn't the type to lead a grief-stricken search party. He hated the cold, and he hated these woods unless he was shooting something, unless he was hiding something. Chloe remembered the missing binoculars, the explosive rage. It hadn't just been about the gear, it had been about someone snooping in his truck. Rumors in Oakhaven had always suggested Richard supplemented his meager mechanic's salary with less savory ventures, methamphetamine runs from Durango, poaching trophy elk out of season. The Blackwood tract, abandoned and vast, was the perfect hiding spot for contraband. A sharp, distant sound snapped her out of her thoughts. Crack. It was the unmistakable sound of a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot. It came from the ridge above her, less than 200 yards away. Chloe pressed herself flat against the ice. Through the gaps in the scrub oak, she saw movement. 2 figures crested the ridge. The first was Richard, clad in a heavy blaze-orange hunting parka, a scoped hunting rifle slung casually over his shoulder. The second was Brutus, his massive, scarred plot hound, sniffing furiously at the snow. They were moving parallel to her position, heading generally toward the area where her dugout was hidden. Panic threatened to choke her. If Brutus caught her scent, it was over. The dog was trained to track bears. A human scent trail, especially one as strong as hers, would be a neon sign. If Richard found the dugout, he wouldn't bring her home. A girl who had survived 4 months in the wild, knew too much, possessed too much grit. She was a loose end, a testament to his cruelty that he would gladly bury in the hole she had dug herself. Think, Chloe ordered herself. You know this terrain better than he does. You live here. She needed to throw the dog off her scent and get back to the dugout to extinguish the fire before Richard saw the smoke. She slowly reached into her pocket. She had brought a small Ziploc bag of crushed, dried chili flakes she had scavenged from Arthur Pendleton's rations, intending to use them to season whatever meat she caught. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all she had. She began to crawl backward, sliding silently over the ice crust, putting the scrub oak between herself and the ridge. She moved agonizingly slow, her eyes locked on the blaze-orange jacket moving through the trees above. Suddenly, Brutus stopped. The massive hound threw his head back, his nose testing the wind. A low, vibrating bay echoed through the silent woods. "What you got, boy?" Richard's voice drifted down the ridge, gruff and impatient. "Find it." The dog jerked hard on its leash, dragging Richard directly toward the slope that led down to Chloe's position. Brutus had caught the scent of the rabbit blood lingering on her gloves. Chloe scrambled to her feet. Stealth was no longer an option. She sprinted down the ravine, her boots slipping and sliding on the treacherous ice. "Hey!" Richard's voice cracked like a whip behind her. "Hey! Who's down there?" She didn't look back. She tore open the Ziploc bag as she ran. At a narrow choke point between two massive boulders, she stopped, dumped the entire contents of the chili flakes onto the snow, and used her boot to violently kick the powder into the air, creating a stinging, invisible cloud of capsaicin directly over her tracks. She kept running, her lungs burning, the cold air searing her throat. Behind her, she heard the heavy crashing of Richard and the dog descending the slope. Then, a sudden, violent yelp of pain echoed through the trees, followed by the frantic sound of a dog sneezing and thrashing in the snow. "Brutus, what the hell?" Richard yelled. The chili trap had worked, blinding the dog's olfactory senses temporarily. But it wouldn't stop Richard. He had seen a figure running. Chloe veered sharply to the east, purposefully leading her tracks away from the fallen oak tree and her hidden sanctuary. She led him through the thickest, most punishing brambles she could find, letting the thorns tear at her clothes. She ran until her legs gave out, diving under the root system of a hollowed-out stump nearly a mile away from her home. She lay curled in the freezing dirt, holding her breath, listening to Richard's distant curses echoing through the trees as he lost the trail in the fading afternoon light. She had evaded him today. But the ghost of Oakhaven was in her woods, and the ultimate test of her survival was no longer just the winter, it was the man who had thrown her into it. Fear is a highly combustible fuel. It burns hot and bright, but it consumes the vessel that holds it. Chloe Harper knew she could not live in a state of perpetual panic. Returning to her subterranean shelter after evading Richard and his plothound, she immediately smothered the fire in the Ondal firebox with damp earth. For 3 agonizing days, she lived in the freezing dark, wrapped in the scavenged canvas and wool blanket, eating cold venison jerky and listening to the wind. Her mind raced, piecing together the fractured puzzle of Richard's presence. He wasn't a man who enjoyed the wilderness, nor was he the type to mount a relentless, guilt-driven search for a stepdaughter he despised. The incident with the binoculars had been the catalyst for her expulsion, but the absolute fury behind it had always felt disproportionate. On the 4th day, the temperature rose just enough to soften the top layer of the snowpack. Chloe crawled out of the dugout, her muscles stiff from the bitter cold. She needed to understand her enemy's territory. She meticulously retraced her steps to the massive, uprooted oak tree that formed the backbone of her shelter. The root system was a chaotic tangle of frozen earth and dead wood, creating deep, shadowed crevices. While gathering dry bark near the base of the root wad, her iron spade struck something that did not sound like wood or stone. It was a hollow, synthetic thwack. Frowning, Chloe scraped away the frost and dead leaves. Wedged deep within the primary fork of the dead roots, completely invisible, unless one were crawling on their hands and knees, was a thick, 6-inch PVC pipe, sealed with heavy threaded caps on both ends. She pried it loose with her spade, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was heavy. She carried it down into the entrance tunnel of the dugout and used the screwdriver on her Swiss Army knife to desperately lever the frozen cap until it finally gave way with a hiss of pressurized air. Inside was not survival gear. It was a vacuum-sealed plastic bag containing thick stacks of $100 bills, bound with rubber bands. Beneath the cash was a worn leather ledger and a collection of high-capacity memory cards. Chloe opened the ledger. The pages were filled with Richard's messy, cramped handwriting. They detailed dates, coordinates, and massive sums of money exchanged for stolen heavy construction machinery, illegal narcotics ferried across county lines, and black market transactions for poached trophy game. The binoculars hadn't been the issue at all. Richard's paranoia had spiked because Chloe had been in the garage near his truck, where he likely kept the keys or the map to this very cache. He had thrown her out not just out of cruelty, but out of a desperate need to protect his illicit empire. And by an astronomical twist of fate, Chloe had built her sanctuary directly beneath his bank vault. A chilling realization washed over her. Richard wasn't looking for her. He was looking for his money. The heavy snow had changed the landscape so drastically that he had lost his bearings. But the spring thaw was rapidly approaching. The snow would melt, the landscape would reveal itself, and Richard would find the oak tree. When he did, he would find her dugout. She had to leave. But the Colorado winter was not done. A late-season squall moved in that evening, dumping another 18 inches of heavy, wet snow, followed by a sudden plunge in temperature that locked the forest in a thick shell of solid ice. Traveling 30 miles to Durango in these conditions, without proper gear, and weakened by her recent illness, was suicide. She was trapped. She spent the next 2 weeks fortifying her position, transitioning from a survivor to a tactician. She knew the layout of the Blackwood tract better than the men who owned it. She gathered dozens of flexible green saplings, sharpening their ends with Arthur Pendleton's saw. She strategically placed these in the deep drifts surrounding the natural choke points leading to her ravine, burying them just beneath the surface of the snow, angled upward. They wouldn't kill a man, but they would pierce a heavy boot and shatter a shin. Next, she modified her dugout. The mountain lion's attack had left a repaired but vulnerable section in the roof. She carefully untied the parachute cord holding the canvas in place, creating a rigged release system. If someone entered through the front tunnel, she could pull a centralized rope, collapsing a section of the dirt and timber roof directly onto the entranceway, creating an instant barricade and a secondary escape hatch for herself. March arrived with the sound of dripping water. The thaw had begun. The ice crust shattered under the weight of the sun, and the stream at the bottom of the ravine swelled into a roaring, icy torrent. The structural integrity of the dugout was pushed to its absolute limit. The clay floor grew damp, and the ondole system required constant, roaring fires to keep the mud from turning back into a freezing swamp. The smoke was no longer a secret. It was a beacon. On a Tuesday afternoon, as the forest dripped with meltwater, the inevitable arrived. Chloe was outside, checking a snare line, when she heard the distinct, mechanical roar of snowmobiles cutting through the timber tract. There were 2 of them. She sprinted back to the dugout, her boots splashing through freezing slush. She slid into the entrance tunnel, her chest heaving, and grabbed the heavy iron spade. Through the gaps in the woven pine boughs, she watched the ridge above. 2 men dismounted their snowmobiles. One was Richard Bowman, holding a scoped hunting rifle. The other was a towering bearded man named Silas Creed, a notorious local poacher known for his vicious temper. "I'm telling you, it's this ravine." Richard's voice drifted down, sharp and anxious. "The old oak tree is right down there. I can smell wood smoke, Silas. Someone's down there. If some drifter found your stash, Bowman, I'm taking it out of your hide," Silas growled, racking the bolt of his shotgun. They began their descent. The endgame had arrived. Adrenaline, cold, and crystalline, flooded Chloe's veins. The terrified 15-year-old girl who had been cast out into the blizzard no longer existed. In her place stood a creature of the earth, hardened by frost, starvation, and sheer will. She retreated to the back of the dugout, grasping the parachute cord attached to the rigged roof section. The fire in the firebox was burning low, a bed of intense, glowing red coals. Crunch, splash. Heavy boots navigated the slush-filled ravine. "Look at this," Silas's voice boomed, startlingly close. "Tracks, small ones. And look at the bank here. It's been dug out." Suddenly, the woven pine boughs blocking her entrance tunnel were violently ripped away. Daylight, harsh and blinding, flooded the subterranean room. Silas Creed crouched in the opening, his massive frame blocking the exit, the barrel of his shotgun sweeping the shadows. "Well, well," Silas murmured, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Look what we have here. A little rat in a hole." Richard shoved his way past Silas, peering into the dugout. When his eyes landed on Chloe, standing at the back wall with soot smudged across her face and a spade in her hand, the color drained from his face. "Chloe?" Richard whispered, genuine shock fracturing his aggressive demeanor. How are you alive?" "You left me to die, Richard," Chloe said, her voice eerily calm, resonating off the earthen walls. But I found your retirement fund instead. She kicked the heavy PVC pipe, which she had deliberately placed in the center of the clay floor. Richard's eyes locked onto the pipe. Greed instantly eclipsed his shock. Give me that. Now. And maybe I let you walk out of here. She knows too much, Bowman, Silas grunted, raising the shotgun. Nobody walks. Wait, Richard snapped, putting a hand on Silas's barrel. The money first. Richard crawled into the entrance tunnel, his heavy boots slipping on the damp clay. He reached out for the PVC pipe. Chloe didn't hesitate. She kicked the bed of red-hot coals in the firebox, sending a shower of sparks into the air, and instantly dumped a massive pile of damp, green pine needles and the remaining crushed chili flakes directly onto the embers. A thick, blinding, toxic cloud of white smoke and capsaicin erupted from the firebox. Because Richard's body was blocking the entrance, the draft was broken. The smoke instantly filled the small space, expanding with violent force. Richard screamed, clutching his face as the chili-laced smoke seared his eyes and lungs. Silas, standing outside, began coughing violently, firing a blind shot into the dirt ceiling that deafened them all in the confined space. In the chaos, Chloe yanked the parachute cord with all her weight. The repaired section of the roof, burdened with hundreds of pounds of wet earth and snow, collapsed perfectly. Tons of mud, ice, and heavy spruce logs crashed down directly onto the entrance tunnel, burying Richard up to his waist and completely sealing the front exit. Chloe scrambled up the newly created dirt ramp at the back of the dugout, bursting through the collapsed roof hole and into the freezing spring air. She didn't look back. She sprinted toward the roaring, swollen stream at the bottom of the ravine. "Get her!" Richard shrieked from beneath the dirt, thrashing wildly. Silas Creed, his eyes streaming from the smoke, charged after her. He was massive, but he was clumsy in the deep, melting snow. Chloe was light, agile, and she knew where the traps were. She led him toward the choke point between the boulders. Silas, blinded by rage, didn't see the sharpened green saplings hidden just beneath the slush. He stepped heavily. The wood pierced entirely through the calf of his heavy boot. Silas let out a roar of agony, pitching forward and tumbling face first into the freezing, fast-moving water of the stream. Chloe didn't stop to watch him struggle. She scrambled up the opposite embankment, her lungs burning, and broke into a dead sprint toward the county highway. The snow was giving way to mud, making every step a grueling effort. But the sound of the highway, the hum of actual civilization, drew her forward. She burst out of the Blackwood timber tract nearly an hour later, covered in mud, soot, and blood, collapsing onto the wet asphalt of County Road 9. A state trooper cruiser, navigating the slushy road, slammed on its brakes, fishtailing to a halt. Deputy Thomas Miller threw open his door, his hand on his holster, before freezing at the sight of the feral, emaciated teenager on the road. "Radio for backup?" Chloe gasped, looking up at the shocked deputy. "There are 2 men in the ravine, and a whole lot of stolen cash." The aftermath was swift and merciless. Deputy Miller's backup arrived, heavily armed. They found Silas Creed dragging himself out of the stream, half frozen and bleeding. They found Richard Bowman still trapped in the collapsed entrance of the dugout, screaming for help. And they found the PVC pipe. The state police spent a week dismantling Richard's operation. The ledger implicated half a dozen local criminals. Richard Bowman was facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Sarah Bowman, claiming ignorance of the entire operation, quietly packed her bags and left Oakhaven forever. Chloe Harper did not go to a foster home. The story of the girl who engineered an underground fortress and survived the deadliest winter in a decade became a local legend. A sympathetic judge emancipated her, and she was taken in by Mr. Harrison, her biology teacher, who recognized the brilliant, indomitable mind hidden beneath the trauma. The dugout remained in the Blackwood tract, slowly reclaimed by the earth. The ondol floor cracked, the heavy spruce logs rotted, and the vibrant moss concealed the scars of excavation. It returned to the wild, serving as a silent monument to human endurance. Chloe Harper never returned to that ravine. She didn't need to. The fire she had built down in the dark had thawed the freezing terror of her childhood, forging something unbreakable in its place. She went on to study civil engineering, designing structures meant to withstand the most brutal elements the world could offer. When asked by her peers how she possessed such an intuitive understanding of thermal dynamics and load-bearing earth, Chloe would simply smile, her eyes reflecting a quiet, feral strength. She had learned the hard way that when the world throws you to the winter, you don't freeze, you build.